I want to thank everyone for coming today to the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series, brought to you in part by ATLAS.ti, Qualitative Data Analysis, as well as the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. My name's Yvette, and I'll be your host today. Today's webinar is Qualitative Interviews Reconsidered with Dr. Kathryn Roulston. So I'll just give a quick overview of how the webinar will go today. After a quick introduction, Dr. Kathryn Roulston will present her webinar for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have questions at the end. Right now you are all on mute. At the end, if you do have a question and access to a microphone, you can raise your hand and I'll give you microphone privileges and you can ask your question. If not, then you can just write your question in the chat and we'll read your questions out loud. Okay, so today's presenter, Dr. Kathryn Roulston, is Professor and Program Coordinator in the Qualitative Research Methods Program. Her research interests focus on examining qualitative interviewing, topics in music education, and microanalytic approaches to the analysis of talk and interaction. She has published articles on qualitative interviewing in Qualitative Research, Qualitative Inquiry, Qualitative Research Journal, and the International Journal of Qualitative Methods. She also has chapters on various aspects of interviewing in the Sage Handbook of Qualitative Data Analysis, the Sage Handbook of Interview Research, The Complexity of the Craft, and the Oxford Handbook of Qualitative Research in American Music Education. In addition to a book, Reflective Interviewing, A Guide to the Theory and Practice, Dr. Kathryn Roulston also examines the teaching and learning of qualitative research methods and is currently working on a collaborative study examining online delivery of graduate education on qualitative research methods. We're very privileged to have Dr. Kathryn Roulston here today. Kathryn, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Yvette, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be with you today, and I look forward to talking to you about qualitative interviews. As all of you know, I'm sure, qualitative interviews are a primary method used across many disciplines. In qualitative research, there are a range of ways in which interviews might be conducted. For example, there is writing on phenomenological interviews, hermeneutic interviews, feminist and ethnographic approaches to interviewing, as well as more recent postmodern and new materialist conceptualizations of interviews. So today I'll talk a little bit about these different kinds or viewpoints on interviewing. So I see the interview as just not one thing. It means many different things to different researchers. I'll also talk about some of the practical procedures in doing interviews, as well as recent challenges and critiques that methodologists have talked about. So to begin with, broadly speaking, interviews can range from standardized interviews in which questions are highly structured and asked in a specific order to semi-structured interviews in which researchers work with a range of topics yet allow interviewees the freedom to initiate their own topics. And then on the right-hand side on this slide, you see unstructured interviews that really resemble everyday conversation. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on talking about the semi-structured interview, which you see in the middle, since that is the one that is most commonly used by qualitative researchers. In contrast, the unstructured conversation may be used in research, but if a researcher does not have specific topics in mind, it might actually be a rather inefficient way to generate data. So if you talk about anything and you don't generate specific information about the topic that you want to examine, it'll be very difficult to analyze that data. The unstructured conversational interview might fit, though, well with an extended ethnographic study in which you're doing a lot of observations in a field setting, so you want to get to know participants over time. I will not talk today much about structured or standardized interviews either, since these are usually used in quantitative research and the data are analyzed statistically. So let's look a little more at the semi-structured interview. Typically, in a semi-structured interview, the researcher will ask a series of mostly open questions concerning a range of topics that he or she wants to examine. Follow-up questions concerning what the participant has already said are used to generate further description about the topic. Most methodological texts on interviewing suggest avoiding closed questions in semi-structured interviews or qualitative interviews, since these sometimes can close down further discussion, although that does not necessarily happen always. Closed questions, I would argue, can be used in a semi-structured interview to clarify details, though I think you need to use these really judiciously. So I've found when I've looked at interview data, sometimes participants treat a closed question, they will actually respond to a closed question with a story, but that doesn't always occur. So you can see here in a semi-structured interview, a qualitative interview, the interviewer uses the participant's words to generate more information. So you might start with, you mentioned the topic, tell me more about that, or you talked about the topic, describe a specific example of that to generate more description. So open questions are really non-directive questions that allow participants to choose their own terms when they provide descriptions. They're used when researchers want to let participants initiate topics of interest to them. So although the researcher has a topic in mind, the participant themselves can bring topics of interest to the interview. Open questions do not provide assumptions about how participants might answer the questions, and in that way the interview participant can highlight what they take to be important. So let's take a look at a few examples of an open question. Quite often these come in the form of invitations to tell stories. So if I were interested in the topic of long distance running, I might just start my interview with, tell me how you came to be involved in long distance running. And then of course to follow up I could ask what have become known as grand tour or mini tour questions. So an example of a grand tour question, describe a typical training routine for preparing for a 10K run. Or an example of a mini tour question, describe what you usually do when you run each day. So these take more specific topics, but they formulate the question in a way where the participant can talk about any this in any way they like. If you would like to read more about using grand tour or mini tour questions, the reference here by James Spradley is a good text to look at. He wrote a book called The Ethnographic Interview. So in contrast, let's take a look at closed questions. Closed questions provide possible responses in the question, or they request specific facts or information from the participant. So in that way, closed questions limit the interviewee's responses and they don't provide a place for the participant to tell longer stories or give longer descriptions. Researchers used closed questions if they want to generate data using the researcher's pre-established categories, and then they avoid providing places within the interview for the participant to initiate their own topic of interest. So closed questions are used in standardized interview or structured interviews, as I mentioned earlier. Now, interview guides that are structured only using closed questions really assume that the researcher is neutral and doesn't impact the data generation, and usually closed questions would be asked in a specific sequence using exactly the same wording. James Holstein and Jaber Gubrium, who've written much on interviews, have discussed this conception of the interview subject in what they call a vessel of answers approach. So really here the conceptualization of an interview is that the interview subject simply has information if the interviewer asks specific questions in a specific order that they can find the answers or locate the answers. Now in contrast, Holstein and Gubrium have promoted the idea of what they call the active interview, in which both the interviewer and the interviewee co-construct meaning together. And in my own work, I have used this idea of co-construction to think about qualitative interviews. If you wanted to read more about this idea of co-constructing interview data, you could look at Holstein and Gubrian's book, The Active Interview, and they've also written much on interviewing since that time and edited the collection, The Handbook of Qualitative Interviews, or Handbook of Interviewing rather. So let's just look a little bit more at what a closed question might look like. An implicit closed question is one in which the interviewer is seeking specific information. So here I have two examples. If we just took up that idea of long distance running, I could ask the question, how many minutes a week have you exercised in the last week? And I'm looking for specific factual information about exercise routines. Another example would be, what time of day do you usually exercise? I'm not looking for a long answer here. I'm looking for specific information about my research topic. Now, explicit closed questions are those in which the potential responses are actually included in the question. So in these examples that you see here, participants have a range of information in the interview question that they can draw on, that they can use to provide the answer. Qualitative researchers usually don't use these kinds of questions in their work because they want participants to come up with their own responses. So for example, I'll just take the second question you see here. How frequently have you engaged in 5K fun runs over the last 12 months? So I have a checklist here, never, 1 or 2, 3 or 4, 5 or more, and I would just simply check the answer that the participant provided. Now, even though methodological texts on interviewing usually say avoid closed questions in qualitative interviews, I take the position that sometimes these can be helpful, and I think they can be particularly helpful if you are clarifying information. And so I have a couple of formulations here as examples of that. So I could just draw on what a participant has said. Earlier you talked about X topic. Would it be correct to say Y? And here I'm formulating what has been said and checking if a participant understands what I've said in the same way. And at these kinds of questions, participants can disagree with. They could say, no, that's not what I meant, and go on to explain and correct my understanding of what has been said. So I'm going to move along here now and talk a little about different types of interviewing that have been discussed in the methodological literature. I don't see this as an exhaustive list. People are continually innovating on interview practice. So here are some that you will read about though. The first, phenomenological interviews. I've got a separate slide for this. So you see the list here. I'm just going to talk a little bit about each one. Phenomenological interviews are conducted where interviewers want to generate detailed and in-depth descriptions of participants' experiences about a lived experience or phenomenon. For example, you might want to generate understandings of the lived experience of grieving or loneliness. These studies are often informed by phenomenological theories, and I've put a couple of references at the bottom of this slide. So Mark Fargley, who is in education, and Max van Menen, who is originally retired from the University of Alberta, has written much on phenomenological approaches to research. They've both written on how to do phenomenological studies. Now, not all people who say that they do phenomenological interviews are interested in doing a phenomenological study though. So just I think you would need to be careful how you're describing both the research design for your study and the kind of interview that you are looking at. Phenomenological interviews use open questions that are non-directive, and really the interviewer in this kind of interview would take a very neutral position. They wouldn't, for example, talk about their own experience within that framework. Now there is some more recent writing on hermeneutic interviews. You can see here Christine Dinkins has written about her idea of a Socratic hermeneutic interpreter view. So she's taken the idea of interpretation from hermeneutics and thought about that in relation to interviewing. So in this kind of interview, the researchers and participants are really playing the role of co-inquirers and engaging in a shared dialogue that evolves through questions and responses. So there's greater emphasis in this form of interview as compared to what we saw in the phenomenological interview on shared dialogue rather than the non-directive questioning. So for example, another scholar who writes in this vein is Sven Brinkmann. He's written on the idea of epistemic interviews. So really, the interviewer might go into more depth to ask for participants' reasoning and rationales for what they say in an interview. And Melissa Freeman has also taken this approach in her writing on hermeneutic process in use of focus groups and how one might analyze data. There's a good deal written on ethnographic interviews. You see a couple of references here. Ethnographic interviews, the purpose of these is to explore the meanings that people ascribe to the actions and events in their own cultural worlds and how they express this in their own terms and language. So in terms of analysis, you might need to take an ethnographic approach to study how people use language in a particular setting. Ethnographers are more likely to begin using informal interviews, so one wouldn't sit down and record these. One might be just asking questions as part of hanging out in a setting or as part of one's participant observations. And then only much later in the research process would one sit down and conduct formal interviews with an interview guide that one would record. In ethnographic interviews, what one observes in the field setting in extended field work is very much part of how one constructs those interview guides and what one talks about. So moving along to feminist interviews, feminists use interviews to advance research which explores women's causes in patriarchal society. And so feminists using interviews aim very much to have a shared experience with participants that are respectful and ethical and highlight women's voices within their studies. There's an recognition in methodological writing on feminist interviewing of the importance of language and discourse in the doing of those interviews, and I would recommend the DeVault 1990 article here. There's some very specific strategies that DeVault talks about for how to listen to women's viewpoints. Now, feminist researchers don't really have one form of interview. So they use many different forms of interviewing. They might use what they call semi-structured interviews, they might use focus groups, they might use oral history interviews. So really the idea of feminist interviewing here is one of exploring feminist relationships with participants in the work of doing research for feminist purposes. Now more recently you have some writers talking about interviewing from a postmodern perspective. So Norman Danson, for example, in his 2001 article in Qualitative Research has written about what he calls the reflexive interview. So here the idea is not so much on how one might conduct a qualitative interview, but how one might use the interview as a vehicle for producing performance texts and performance ethnographies about self and society. And so Norman Danson has talked about generating ethnographic performances, and you might use interview data to construct poems or dramatic scripts. But really, again, just like the feminist interview, the the idea is not on how one might conduct an interview, but how one might analyze, conceptualize the presentation and the findings from interview research. And he's extended his work on that in his book in 2010, The Qualitative Manifesto, if you want to look more at that. And just recently, Aaron Kuntz and his colleague Presnell have written about the idea of intra-views. They just look at my last dot point there here. So here the intra, prefix intra, meaning within, displaces the prefix inter, meaning between. So the idea of an intra-view, meaning what's going on within the view. So this conceptualization of an interview employs new materialist writing from scholars, and in particular the feminist physicist Karen Barad, to reconceptualize what we mean by an interview and how we might think about the interview in terms of representation of findings. So you see here, these scholars talk about resituating the interview as a process-based, embodied and emplaced interactive event. And so it's bringing the material back into the interviewing rather than just talking about language, so multiple bodies. This is a complex way of thinking about interviewing, and I would urge you, if you wanted to look at that further, to look at both this article and new writing coming out on new materialisms and new empiricisms. So on this slide, I'm just going to turn now to very practical matters. So you can see three phases here: preparing for interviews, conducting interviews, and what happens after the interview. And across the top you can see a lot of different items. So there's a good deal of work that gets done before you conduct an interview in order to prepare for interviews. Because we see interviews all the time on television and we listen to them on the radio, there's a tendency to think that interviews are really easy. All we have to do is ask a few questions and then participants are going to answer. But there's a lot of steps to go into getting ready. We have to formulate interview guides. So what I usually do is, once I've formulated various research questions, is I generate topics that I need to ask questions about. And then for each research question, I might generate 3 or 4 interview questions. I work at generating questions that are clear, short, open-ended, and that will generate, hopefully, information that is to do with the research question I've asked. This also involves reflecting on the topic. With newcomers to research, particularly qualitative interviews, I sometimes suggest to students to try out the interview, and if they would be a potential participant on the topic that they're looking at, they might have a friend or a colleague interview them using their interview guide. Quite often I still pilot or test out my interview guide before I take it into a research project. So that just means getting help from a colleague, trying out the interview to see how the questions go. And if some of the questions, participants don't understand them in the way that I hope they would, I might revise those. Preparing for interviews also involves getting ethical review from one's institution. Here in the United States, I have to put my research protocol with the interview guide into what's known as the Institution Review Board for approval before I can undertake any research with human subjects. So how that works in different countries differs by country, and also depending on where you are conducting your research, you might have to, there might be multiple layers of ethical review. So for example, if you were doing interviews in a school district or in a hospital, you might have to submit your proposal to be reviewed by another ethical review board. I always test out my equipment prior to interviews. Some researchers actually have multiple recording devices in the interviews because sometimes things malfunction. So generally speaking, I use a digital recorder these days, so we no longer use cassette tapes like we did 10 or 15 years ago. And then the next step, once one has approval for a research topic to conduct research, one would need to go and recruit participants. At my institution, I have to lay out the plans for my review board of how I would go about recruiting participants. Now, if one is studying a topic that's highly sensitive or involves vulnerable participants, that recruitment process might involve going into a setting and doing recruiting face-to-face where you talk to potential participants and ask them if they would agree to participate in your study. Once you have some participants, you need to sort out a time when you meet with them. I usually recommend finding a quiet space in which to conduct interviews so that you can record them. If you go into public settings such as restaurants or cafes, sometimes it's very noisy and you might find it very difficult to transcribe your interview data, but sometimes that's not always possible either. The only place you can interview people would be in a public setting with background noise. Of course, I am required by my institutional review board to gain informed consent. Usually in the studies I do, they're not with vulnerable populations, so I gain written informed consent, and I keep one copy of the consent form for myself and then one for the participant. However, in the United States, sometimes there may be studies in which you just gain oral consent, and again, that's something that you would need to work out with your institutional review board. And then, of course, you can see in the middle here, that's the actual interview, asking questions. So generally, you would sequence your interview questions from probably broad, more general questions at the beginning of an interview, through more specific questions, and through a phase at the end of the interview where you close down the interview and just let them know that you're coming to the end and don't end too abruptly. Generally speaking, I usually would think that a qualitative interview would take at least 60 minutes. I've had interviews go up to 2 hours. So again, in preparation, particularly with technology, you would expect a specific period of time for an interview, but sometimes things take longer than expected as well. So in terms of scheduling, you might have multiple interviews on the one day. Make sure you leave plenty of space between interviews. Now, methodologists write about a lot of different issues to do with specific populations or contextual issues. So if researchers are doing interviews with participants in a language that will not be the language of presentation, they need to think about at what point they are going to translate data. Some researchers may actually have a translator asking the questions in the interview and then translating the responses back. And then there is a range of methodological literature on very specific populations. So this ranges from people who are ill or dying and special considerations if you're doing research on those topics, through to children and adolescents. So for example, interviewing is quite difficult to handle with young children, and some researchers use other kinds of methods to generate information. So they might use drawings or images or other ways to generate data in interviews with children. And then, of course, at any given point in time, most of us are going to be interviewing across difference, whether it's gender, sexual orientation, language. So we need to think about that as we conduct our interviews. Once you have your data, which would mostly be audio recorded for qualitative research, you would need to think through how to transcribe that, how much information you're going to put in, and then how to analyze and represent that. I'm not going to talk about data analysis and representation too much today, but there's many, many different ways of analyzing data and representing that to audiences. Now, across the methodological literature, you'll see a fair degree of consistency as to what good interviewing entails. So we really do need to prepare well for our interviews and then respect our interviewees. You might think about whether the interviewees are going to have the transcript from your interviews, or in some cases you might even check the findings with them, whether you give them the final report or an interim report. That is something to think about as you construct the informed consent. Then, of course, mostly in interviews, what you really need to do is just listen very carefully to your participant. And then if you're new to interviewing, that can be difficult to do because you might be thinking about what question to ask next instead of listening to what they're saying. But certainly if you have put a lot of thoughtfulness into how you develop your interview guide, that's not going to be such a problem. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I generally try for fewer questions, using short open-ended questions, not asking too complicated questions or more than one question at a time. And then I'm always flexible because sometimes my plans don't to go as planned, and I might have to deviate from prior plans. I think one thing that's really important to do in preparing for interviews is to have some good starters for follow-up questions to gain more information. So rather than simply ask a question and then go to the next question on the interview guide, just ask for more information or a specific example, and that's really easy to do with those sentence starters like you mentioned X, give me a specific example of that, or you mentioned Y, what was that like for you, tell me more about that. That will certainly get you more information or more description about what your topic is. Really, the interviewer's role is just to help participants tell their stories and listen carefully. Now, I have an image here of the journalist Terry Gross in the United States. She has a radio program called Fresh Air, and there's a website for that, and you can actually listen to some of her interviews. Terry Gross is actually widely known as a very good interviewer, although if you listen to some of her interviews, some of them certainly didn't go as probably she expected either. She's conducted thousands of interviews though, so it's interesting just to listen to how other people do interviews, and we can learn from those. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that occur in doing interview research. So here we have the kinds of challenges that occur in or during the interview where you're asking questions. So sometimes it can be really difficult to ask questions about certain topics if they're sensitive or difficult topics, or if you're engaging in research that's risky. So for example, some researchers do research that might be dangerous, going into settings where they, like I'm thinking of examples where war or researchers doing research on terrorism, topics like that. Sometimes even in the most mundane topics, unexpected things occur, problematic locations. So all of these things, I think, just call on a qualitative researcher to be flexible in what goes on. And then, of course, even though some people volunteer to be participants of studies, sometimes they're reluctant to talk about topics. That might happen, for example, if you're using a gatekeeper in a research study who recruits participants on your behalf. And then all kinds of things can occur just because of the interviewer and interviewee relationships. And then, of course, sometimes participants might not be telling things that you suspect are not truthful, so that might be something to think about as well. Now, there's all kinds of issues to do with the challenges after the interview as well, and there's much writing in qualitative inquiry about how we represent the other. So, for example, how would we represent various dialects in ways that don't stereotype participants? If you are providing the findings back to participants or they read your findings, they might actually not agree with how you've interpreted the data. So what does a researcher do then? And then of course there's issues to do with how do you include sensitive information in your reports, and given that qualitative research relies on thick descriptions, how can you present data in ways that make sure that the participants' identity is confidential? That can be a challenge too. These are a couple of issues that are important to think in terms of the design of an interview study. Will you use interviews as a standalone method or a mixed method? And that might be something to think about in relation to your discipline. Your discipline might have preferences there. So for example, historians usually require documentary sources to verify oral history accounts. So oral historians would just not have the oral history accounts. They would go to the documents as well and archives. Then, of course, more and more researchers are using visual methods to support the elicitation of data. So they might bring photos into the interview and talk about those photos. The images might be generated by the researcher, or sometimes participants might generate those photos and bring them to the interview. And then, of course, photos can also be used as illustrations in the research as well. In ethnographic work, researchers would always use field notes of participant observations in conjunction with ethnographic interviews. And then researchers also need to think about whether they're going to use one-off interviews, just a single interview, or whether they're going to generate multiple interviews over time. Now, there are critiques of interview data that one might need to consider. What is the status of interview data as evidence? That's something to think about. So methodologists have talked about how some studies don't take into account the co-construction of interview data, nor do they take into account the socially situated nature of interview data. By that I mean how this particular interviewer in this particular setting generated this data with these particular participants. And then of course sometimes participants don't always remember things accurately, so how might one account for that in a research study? What does one need to do design-wise? And then there's more recently from Potter and Hepburn, they've talked about how in the analysis and representation of data one might think about including the interview questions that have been asked and how the interviewer has responded to the interviewee and what he or she has said within the interview, and what are the details of the production of talk. For example, what else happens? Are there lengthy pauses, or are people laughing in the interview? Has that been included in the transcription? So both David Silverman and Potter and Hepburn have written more on the critiques. Just going to very briefly talk a little bit about new developments in interviewing before I finish up. So here's an image from the online site called BuzzFeed. They, in 2015, talked about doing the first political emoji interview. So these little icons that we get on smartphones. They conducted an interview entirely using emojis with Julie Bishop, who was Australia's Foreign Affairs Minister. I think it's highly unlikely that anytime soon social science researchers are going to be using emojis, although if you are going to use text in your as a part of your interviewing, that maybe you will be using emoji. But certainly researchers have taken up the use of all kinds of new technologies. So there's a good deal now about synchronous online interviewing. So researchers using things like Skype to conduct interviews. People have talked about email interviewing. So I've seen work on how researchers have, for example, conducted email interviews with people with traumatic brain injuries. It gives them more time to develop their responses. And then I've seen a little work on text messaging in interview practice. Janet Simmons is someone who's written on synchronous online interviews, if you would like to read more on that. So I have come to the end of my presentation here, and I have just put a few of the articles and chapters that I've written on interviewing. The presentation today is really based on a chapter that I've been writing with Myung-Won Choi, which is going to go into the SAGE Handbook of Qualitative Data Collection. And then after this presentation, I'll make this PowerPoint available to you as well. So I'm just going to finish up here with questions, I believe.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kathryn. That was a great presentation. We do have some questions here. I'll first start with Meti. I'm going to give you microphone rights. If you have a microphone, you can go ahead and ask your question. Okay, maybe not doesn't have access to microphone. So we've got another question from Marina. And Marina's question is, can you please talk about bracketing during the interview process?
Sure. Bracketing is a concept that one finds written about in relation to phenomenological research. And the idea here is that researchers think about their own assumptions, biases, preconceptions around a particular research topic or concept, and they set those aside as they do their research. Now, there's a good deal of writing which argues that it's not possible to set those prior assumptions or preconceptions about the research topic aside when one does an interview. So I think how I think about the use of the idea of bracketing in interviewing is for a researcher to reflect on what he or she brings to a research topic prior to conducting the interview, and so and what this research means. So in any particular study, I might think I know how participants are going to talk about a particular topic. So what I might do is write about that in some kind of reflective notebook. I have students, when I teach interviewing, do what is called as a bracketing interview. I've written about that in the 2010 book, in which they and a colleague sit down and they just talk to one another about how they came to the topic, what they expect to find. And by doing that bracketing interview, it gives one a good sense of what one's assumptions and preconceptions about the topic are. So I don't think it's possible to set these aside or necessarily. Another person who's written on this is the phenomenologist Karen Dahlberg. She doesn't use the term bracketing, but has put forward the idea of bridling as one. She's a horse rider apparently, so one has a bridle on a horse. So by reflecting on one's preconceptions about a topic, one can see how that translates into the actual interview process and how one analyzes and represents the data.
Okay, great. Thank you. We also have a question here from Rita Gorawana Bat. Rita, I'm going to give you the microphone. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sometimes when we go into the field with certain ideas about what we might find, we find something quite contrary to that. And that can raise some doubts in when you represent this in a paper as to how, what did you really do? So your questions were designed to perhaps ask some questions, but you came out with something different. what happened? Can you address this?
Yes, thank you, Rita. I think this, to me, comes under the idea of emergent topics, which you'll see written about in qualitative inquiry. So whereas some research is hypothesis-driven, so for example, you have a hypothesis of what you think you will find, qualitative inquiry is not necessarily hypothesis-driven. So you're seeking to find what's going on in a particular setting, and sometimes this doesn't always match what your assumption about what is going on in a setting. So I'll just give you a little example. In my own doctoral work, I was looking at itinerant teachers' work, and I had privileged the idea of itinerants as very important in their work. But in actual fact, when I interviewed them, they didn't talk about that so much. They were very interested to tell me more stories about the idea of the restructuring of their work. I won't go into the details here. So that was an emergent topic which wasn't really included in the formulation of my research questions. It was more important to my participants, but because that topic emerged during the doing of the research, it was something that I did report on. So I would encourage people doing qualitative inquiry, if you, for example, are using a semi-structured interview where you have formulated and asked open questions about the topic, sometimes participants will bring topics to the researcher's attention that the researcher wasn't initially focused on. So I think in terms of reporting that, you could just state that that's what occurred. So participants continually oriented to this topic, and that it produced lots of rich data, and you can report findings on that. But that would be an emergent topic rather than a topic driven by the research questions necessarily.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions coming in here. One from Kiko Theo. Who was the person who has written about interviewing with Skype?
The Janet Salmons, Janet, and her surname is Salmons. She's written a book on synchronous online interviewing, and it's published by Sage.
Okay. And then from Laurie Joff, can you please give us the reference for the synchronous interviews again? Oh, that was,
yes.
yeah.
I will add that to the PowerPoint before I send it to you.
Okay, perfect. And then the next question comes from Alana Delahunty-Pike. Thank you for the presentation. Can you offer some advice on how to appropriately and ethically probe for more information with a reluctant interviewee?
That's a really good question, and I think there's a chapter in the Handbook of Interviewing which talks about interviews between cross-gender interviews, like I think it's women interviewing men, and they talk about sometimes interactional problems occurring there, and they have specific suggestions for that specific context. I think it's hard to offer general advice here because it's almost like each interview context around reluctant interviewees is specific, and you might need to think through, well, why is it that participants are reluctant to be interviewed? So I'll just give you an example. This has happened to me on a particular project, and I just very recently had this experience. So I was involved in an interview with a co-researcher where we had a group of participants, And it was clear that the participants were very reluctant to say on record what their perceptions were, and we wanted to get their perspectives, but they didn't want to say. They were very reluctant. And so in this particular research project, we didn't have the opportunity to reschedule individual interviews, but in another project I was involved in where exactly the same thing occurred, what was happening here is the participants did not want to go on record in front of their peers with whom they worked, so they were talking as part of a group with people they worked with, and they didn't want to go on record with their opinion. I was able to redesign the project to include individual interviews, and on a one-on-one basis, participants were happy to talk to me. So that might be one solution. Now, if it's occurring in an individual interview, I certainly would look very closely at the kinds of sticky points that are going on in the interview as to try and figure out maybe there's specific topics that people don't want to talk about. There is a chapter in the Handbook of Interviewing on reluctant interviewees as well that might have some suggestions there. Another strategy that I've used, so for example, I have one very reluctant interviewee at one point who did not want to answer questions, but once I was able to ask an open question of this participant and they got to talking, then later on in the interview I was able to circle back to the topic that they didn't want to answer at the beginning. So part of this is also to do with rapport building, which I didn't talk about, but certainly if people are uncomfortable with the interviewer for any reason, you might just need to get to know them. You might have to spend more time in a setting for people to get to know you. That's not always possible, I understand, in research interviews. But anyway, that's a few suggestions for reluctant interviewees.
Thanks, Kathryn. And next question comes from Caroline Sanders. Do you have any experience of difficult interviews where a disclosure is made that warrants an intervention, such as patient safety, child protection, and how have you managed the distress with participants when disclosures have to be acted upon?
Caroline, I do not have any specific experiences of my own about that. These are really tough ethical issues. They're also guided by the institution here in the United States too, so depending where you live in the world, there may be institutional requirements. So for example, in the informed consent form that I'm required to use at my institution, there's a specific sentence that says information will be confidential unless required, other than required by law. I just can't think of the wording. But what it means there is if a participant were to report something that I am mandated to report, so for example, child abuse or whatever, I am required by law. So there's no questions about that. I have to report it. And so I'm not sure that I can't offer any specific experiences about that, but definitely this gets into very ethical decision making on the part of the interviewer, and in fact figuring out what to do that. There's a good deal of literature in the ethics literature on various protocols for figuring out what your course of decision making might be around what to do next. So I would certainly refer you to ethics literature there.
Okay, and the next question comes from Janelle Marino. How long should a researcher keep in possession interviewee-signed informed consent forms?
Janelle, I think that one also is like an institutional issue because the institution will have mandated requirements for how long informed consent forms should be kept. And I actually have not looked at that across institutions, but they might very well have different time limits.
Okay, and the next one comes from Katie Kellum. What are your thoughts about allowing participants to see interview questions before meeting?
That's a great question. I've had that question myself. Years ago, I had a participant who asked me for the interview questions prior to the interview, and I sent those to her. And then I was interviewing her at her house, so I went to her house, and she had written out answers to each of the questions. And then when we sat down to do the interview, she said, here's my answers, and she gave me the piece of paper. So I was faced with the issue right then and there of what to do next. And in fact, I did sit down with her and I conducted probably a 45, 60-minute interview. I just don't remember how long it was now. But I think I don't see any hard and fast rule here. I think sometimes it's useful for participants to have the interview questions prior, particularly if there's some kind of research that they need to do. Yeah, so I think I don't usually send them to interviewees prior to interviews. I think, but if they ask for them, I would certainly share them with them.
Okay, and next question comes from Derek Roth. Excuse me. In the event that the technology fails mid-interview, what are some strategies the researcher can take to preserve or capture data that was missed in the recording?
Sure. I've had an interview fail. I had that very miserable experience many years ago of it was a great interview. This person was very helpful, and my audio recorder didn't work. So this person very kindly agreed to do a second interview with me. I don't think it was as good as the first one. So that's like an extreme case. I probably would pause the interview, and I could either, depending on how the interview was going, I would just sit there and take notes. I think that is one reason why some interviewers have two recording devices in the interview. And at times I've done that. I don't always do that. But if you're using digital recording devices, I think one really important thing to be aware of is that maybe the interview is going to go longer than you expect, and you really need to be careful that you have sufficient space on your recording device so that you're not going to run out of space for the interview. So I think you could use two recording devices. I did a video interview which failed in the middle of, I was looking at that transcript recently. The video recording device stopped, and so the video recording stopped, but I also had an audio recorder, and I just completed the interview, but I didn't capture the whole thing on video. So yeah, I would say be prepared, and then also be flexible.
Okay, and the next one comes from Marina Zonofontos. Can you please talk about the ideal or minimum number of interviews needed for achieving data saturation in a study adopting the pragmatist worldview?
Now, there's a specific report published on one of the websites in the United Kingdom, which is how many interviews is enough. And I think that probably is the best source to look at that. I can see if I can put that into the PowerPoint, the source for that. I think it's very difficult to figure out how many interviews is enough, and it really depends on the study, the worldview. So for example, if you're using, say, Kathy Sharma's constructivist grounded theory, you would be using theoretical sampling. So the number of interviews is really going to depend on what you find, and so you won't know that until you're actually conducting the study. But I will add that source. I'll just make a little note.
Okay, and there's another one from Lori Goff. Do you have a resource you recommend for email questionnaires?
I don't generally use the term questionnaire actually for a qualitative interview. I see questionnaires as more aligned with standardized surveys, which I don't use. So if I were to develop an email interview protocol, I would use the same kinds of principles as I described earlier, which is to formulate open questions. Again, but I haven't seen a specific source on formulation of email interview protocols, but I don't think it would be too different to the formulation of a qualitative interview protocol. But there certainly is much literature on formulation of survey and questionnaires, and those are more standardized, like William, I can't think of his first name, Foddy has written a book on that.
Okay. And we are out of time for the 1 hour, but there are quite a few questions left. Kathryn, would it be okay for people to email you, or I can send you these questions and you can answer them?
Sure, if you just send me the questions, I'm happy. I'll respond and I'll send those back to you.
Okay, perfect. So I'm sorry for anyone who did submit questions and didn't get them answered, but I will send those to Kathryn and then reply with the answers. I'd like to thank everyone very much for coming to our presentation today. The next webinar will be on May 9th, and it will be Claudia Mitchell doing participatory video, taking a no editing research approach. Thanks again, Kathryn, for coming and speaking for us today. Do you have any final words?
Well, I just want to thank you everyone for attending, and thank you Yvette for facilitating this, and thanks for all the questions, and I'll just add a couple of references to the PowerPoint and I'll send that on to Yvette.
Perfect, and so we'll get the PowerPoint up, should be before the end of the week, and then recording, if not tomorrow, then by next week. So thank you everyone for coming and have a great day.
Thank you.